Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Spirit, the stimulating program initiative for retirees that inspires thought. I'm Judy Steinig, Director of Community Programs for the Orthodox Union, and it's my honor to coordinate and host this program. Spirit was started several years ago as an on-site program, and now we're happy to present it as an online program for retirees, not yet retirees, empty nesters, baby boomers, sandwich generation parents, and seniors. Everybody who is looking for educational, intellectual, and spiritual growth. Now, more than ever, because of the pandemic, Spirit has become the perfect way for each one of us to engage in a virtual setting. Today, we have a very unique and special program planned. Originally, we had scheduled this program to honor our veterans several weeks ago. However, the program was reframed when I became aware of the talent and background of one of our Spirit viewers, a wonderful family friend and a veteran, Jay Goldberg, who was previously on Rediscover and Relocate with Spirit this summer with his Ashes Kyle Wendy. We are so honored to have him back again, and with Wendy in the background as tech support. Before Jay speaks, I'm privileged to call upon one of our honored veterans, Joseph Lashner from the United States Army, who will introduce the program. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. Do you hear me? Hello?
We hear you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. And yes, I am a U.S. Army veteran. And not only am I a U.S. Army veteran, I was born in Israel and living here most of my life. Became entered the U.S. Army in 1976 and served till 1979, mostly in Europe. It was the post-Vietnam era. There are a few Israeli Americans like myself who were in the military, but I'm not going to focus on myself now. I'm just going to introduce my good friend, Jay Goldberg, who will talk to you about this wonderful subject. Okay, Jay has a BA in history and an MA in social studies from Queens College. He also has a PD degree from St. John's University School of Administration. He served in the U.S. Army Reserves in the early 1970s. At this point of time, I'd like to have Jay make his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate that. This morning, and by the way, thank you, Rebbetzin Steinig, for your help and for running this program and for having the confidence in me. I'd also like to thank in advance my tech support, my wife who's behind the scenes, who is helping with some of the PowerPoint. Now, as you see in the title, Unveiling Jewish American Heroes, just be aware that, of course, this is not going to be all-inclusive, and I'm not going to list every single person who may have done something for this country. So I'm going to give a general overview. I'd like to start with a question for everyone, and we're not grading this, so we won't know your answer. But the question is very simple. If you had to take a guess as to the percentage of Jewish people in the first graduating class at West Point, what do you think that number would be? Some of you may have said 2%, 10%. The actual answer is 50%, because the first class in 1802, to which Simon Levy graduated, was made up of only 2 students. Now, since 1654, Jews have fought alongside their compatriots for the freedom and justice that they all cherished. In 1654, Asher Levy, who was one of 23 original Jewish settlers, demanded and obtained the right to stand guard at the stockade in New Amsterdam, which is present-day New York. Now, Peter Stuyvesant, who was a known anti-Semite, didn't want to let the Jews participate until he was finally forced by the Dutch West India Company, which had many Jewish directors on its board. And in fact, Jews served in the military, in the militias in each of the 13 colonies. In this presentation, I'd like to give you an overview of Jewish participation in our country's conflicts from the American Revolution to the present. During the War of Independence, the US population was about 2 million total, with 1,500 to 2,000 Jewish people. Approximately 160 Jews served the country, which was more than 10% of the total Jewish population. Now, many of you are probably familiar with I.M. Solomon, who was a Polish immigrant arriving only a year or two before the American Revolution. Yet he helped to finance the war for the entire duration. He was seized and imprisoned by the British after his release was secured, he continued to secure funds for Washington's army. Interestingly, he died penniless and was buried in an unmarked grave. There was no money for a tombstone, yet no American Jew has a greater monument. In 1941, Chicago citizens erected a large statue recognizing the achievements of this Polish immigrant. In addition, in 1975, he was honored with a US stamp, as well as having a US ship named after him. But there were many others less well known. Born in from 1777 to 1778, Dr. Philip Moses Russell of Richmond, Virginia, served as a surgeon's mate under General George Washington in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Interestingly, the National Archives document Russell as the only known American Jewish soldier who was present at this famous and significant event in US history. While there, he cared for the sick and wounded while revolutionary forces were blockaded by the British. The highest ranking officer in the Continental Army was Deputy Commissary General Mordecai Sheftall. And yes, that is the correct spelling for him. That's how he spelled his name. Now, he was an observant Jew from Savannah, Georgia, and he was nicknamed the Great Rebel. He was in charge of purchases and issues for the Georgia militia. He and his son were captured by the British and held on a British prison ship where they were treated poorly. Eventually, they were sent to Antigua, not on a cruise ship, where Sheftall wrote to the Continental Congress to ask for a prisoner exchange. He and his son escaped, were recaptured, and then freed in 1780. Francis Salvador came from a wealthy Sephardic community in London and was the first Jew elected to public office. He was a delegate to the South Carolina Congress. Most of the Jewish population then were from the South, with the exception of New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, and the South itself produced most of these heroes. Salvador was known as the Paul Revere of the South because in July 1776, when the Cherokees, who were aiding the British in the war, attacked the settlers, he rode 30 miles to warn outlying residents. Later that month, he was the first Jew to give his life for the revolution when he was killed in an ambush and scalped by the Cherokees. Now, everyone knows the name Benedict Arnold. However, few have heard of his lesser known aide, David Salisbury Franks. He attained the rank of major under General Arnold. Now, during Arnold's trial for treason, Franks came under scrutiny. His reputation was tarnished, despite the fact that Benedict Arnold wrote to George Washington attesting that Franks had no knowledge of his treasonous activities and shouldn't be held accountable. Franks was still court-martialed twice, but exonerated. He spent his entire fortune helping the cause for US independence. He should be remembered for his loyalty and courage. Soon after we gained independence, we were at war again with the British in 1812. It was cleverly known as the War of 1812. Now, at that time, the Jewish population had grown to only 2,500, while the US population had tripled to over 7 million. The unusual career of Uriah Levy began during the administration of James Madison. Its impact, however, was felt during the terms of office of 5 presidents right up to Abraham Lincoln. He was the most notable and maligned Jewish participant in the War of 1812. He was one of approximately 40 Jews who fought in the war. He was the first Jewish American Commodore, which is today's equivalent of admiral. He snuck away from home when he was 10 years old to become a cabin boy on a ship. His parents forgave him when he returned home 2 years later to prepare for his bar mitzvah. At 14, he became an apprentice as a seaman, and so began a naval career that lasted over 50 years. Now, while in the Navy, Levy was a victim of anti-Semitism and got into numerous fights and duels because of his religion. As a result, he faced court-martial a number of times, but they all ended in exoneration. Through it all, Levy remained a hero of the War of 1812 and was instrumental in the destruction of 21 British ships. His greatest legacy, however, was ending flogging as a punishment in the US Navy. At 61, Levy married his 18-year-old niece, whose father had recently died. Now, according to his biographer, Levy was following an ancient Jewish tradition that obligated the closest unmarried male relative of an orphaned or widowed woman in financial difficulty to marry her. He died in March 1862 at the age of 69. Now, I don't know if anybody's been to the Naval Academy, but in Annapolis, the chapel there is named after Uriah Levy. Incidentally, he was a great admirer of Thomas Jefferson. And after Jefferson passed away, Monticello was in ruins. He bought it, Levy bought it, restored it with his own money, and then gave it to the US government. Levy commissioned a statue of Jefferson that now sits in the Capitol Rotunda as the only privately owned statue in US property. And by the way, my wife and I visited Monticello a few years ago, and Levy's mother is buried on the grounds. He himself is buried in Ridgewood, Queens. For any of you who live in Queens, it's easily accessible. From the American Revolution to the War of 1812, Maryland required all potential office holders to take a Christian oath. This thereby excluded all Jews. Because of the heroism of the Jewish soldiers and sailors in the War of 1812, the Jew Bill, as it was known, was finally passed in 1824. It removed this requirement, and soon after, 2 Jews were elected to the Baltimore City Council. Just a little factoid, everybody has heard of Davy Crockett and the Alamo. No, David Crockett was not Jewish, but there was the name of a Jew, A. Wolf, and it was inscribed on the Alamo monument along with 2 young sons, mistakenly thought by the Mexicans to have been combatants. This monument was erected in Austin, Texas, to honor those who gave their lives defending the Alamo. His name, Anthony Wolf, many historians have long speculated that he was a Jewish immigrant from Spain. General Zachary Taylor, who later became our 12th president, achieved fame during the Mexican-American War in 1848. His doctor was a Sephardic Jew named David Camden de Leon. He was from Charleston, South Carolina. He rallied his troops after the commanding officer was killed, and he proceeded to win a major battle at Chapultepec, and it earned him the nickname the Fighting Doctor. He was later named the Surgeon General of the Confederate States of America at the start of the Civil War. Now, despite the fact that thousands of Jews fought in the Civil War, it was widely felt and reported in periodicals like the North American Review of December 1891 that few, if any, Jews served in the war between the states. Many rumors spread that the Jews only profited from the war as unscrupulous businessmen and were unwilling or unable to serve. This prompted the social activist Simon Wolf to set the record straight. In 1895, he published the seminal work on Jews in the Civil War. Using first-hand sources, he listed the names of 7,000 Civil War veterans in his book, The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. In 1861, at the outbreak of the Civil War, the US Jewish population was 150,000. Of that, approximately 7,000 fought for the North and 3,000 for the South. Now, most Jews had regional loyalties and fought for the state in which they lived. There were, however, two Jewish companies completely formed and maintained by only Jews, one in Chicago, one in Syracuse. But most Jewish soldiers wanted to serve alongside their fellow comrades rather than stand out because of their religion. Now, many families, you've heard stories and you've seen where many families, brothers, were split in the Civil War. One such family was the Jonas family. There were four brothers, three of them fought for the North and one fought for the South. Their father, Abraham Jonas, was fairly well known because he was one of the closest friends to Abraham Lincoln. Back in Lincoln's days in the 1840s, 50s, before he became well known, Jonas was a big supporter of Abe Lincoln and helped him in his political career and was instrumental in getting him selected and nominated for president in 1860. And this friendship lasted for many years. And during the Civil War, his son, Charles Jonas, was captured and was a prisoner in the prisoner of war camp. At that time, Abraham Jonas was severely ill, gravely ill, was dying, and Abraham Jonas got word to Abraham Lincoln, and he asked that Lincoln allowed Charles Jonas, who was now a prisoner of war at Johnson's Island, a parole of 3 weeks to visit his dying father. It just so happened that Abraham Lincoln immediately wrote a letter, and in his letter, he said, it may not be 100% clear on the screen, he said, allow Abraham Jonas, now a prisoner of war at Johnson's Island, a parole of 3 weeks to visit his dying father, Abraham Jonas, at Quincy, Illinois, on June 2nd, 1864, signed Abraham Lincoln. As it happens, Jonas went to see his father, got there before he died, and then, being an honorable man, reported back to the prisoner of war camp. Now, I can give you just a 2-minute digression on the rabbinic perspective on slavery in the 1850s and 60s. Rabbi Morris Rafal of New York delivered a sermon in 1861 supporting slavery by using the Old Testament as proof of its legitimacy. The South, of course, was happy to reprint his speech, but Rabbi David Einhorn of Baltimore blasted Rabbi Rafal. Einhorn had been condemning slavery since 1856. Unfortunately for him, he spoke and he lived in Maryland, which was a slave state. In the end, he was forced to flee for his safety and had to leave the state, never to return. Now, up until 1861, there were no Jewish chaplains in the US Armed Forces. This spurred a group of Jewish delegates to meet with President Lincoln. They were able to convince Lincoln to accept a Jewish chaplain. This was clearly the first case of a successful Jewish lobbying effort in Washington. Soon after, Reverend Jacob, as they were known, Reverend Jacob Frankel of Philadelphia was appointed the first Jewish chaplain in the Army. Now, the most famous Jewish Confederate was Judah Benjamin, who incidentally was the first Jew elected to the US Senate. During the Civil War, he served in a number of roles. He was first Attorney General, then Secretary of War, and then Secretary of State for the Confederacy. In 1864, when the South was doing poorly, he came up with a radical idea to free the slaves if they agreed to fight for the South. It was a bit too controversial, and they didn't go along with it in the powers that be. In March of 1865, they said, hey, it's a great idea, but it was too late. The war was over in a few weeks. He took quite a bit of abuse when the South was losing, even though he personally had abandoned completely his Jewish practices. He was still frequently the subject of anti-Semitic attacks by Northerners and Southerners, especially as the South was about to lose the war. After the war, he fled the country and lived the rest of his life in England. The highest ranking officer in the Confederate Army was West Point graduate Abraham Myers from South Carolina. He was quartermaster general of the Confederate Army in charge of supplies and clothing. He probably was the first to say, don't worry, it fits fine. By the way, those of you who are from Florida or familiar with Florida, the city of Fort Myers, Florida was named after him. Now, many of you have probably heard of Bernard Baruch, the famous financial wizard, advisor to President Wilson. But how many of you know that his father, Dr. Simon Baruch, who, by the way, was the first doctor to diagnose appendicitis and perform a successful appendectomy, his father was also the personal physician to Robert E. Lee. Now, apparently Lee was smart enough to have a good Jewish doctor, but it wasn't enough to win the war. He also, by the way, is buried in Flushing, Queens. Now, Arlington Cemetery honors the National Military Arlington Cemetery is, of course, the famous National Military Cemetery. But did you know that the only Hebrew military cemetery outside of Israel is the U.S. Cemetery for Hebrew Confederate soldiers located in Richmond, Virginia? There are 121 Jewish Confederate soldiers buried there. During the war, despite the fact that sometimes in the middle of a battlefield, things were difficult to procure when it came to Jewish holidays, etc. A lot of times the soldiers, their families would visit them, bring them provisions, etc. Well, there is one story that I think is interesting that shows how people still clung to their Judaism and felt it was important. If I may read you something about a Civil War Seder that took place in 1862. While stationed at Fayette, West Virginia in 1862, a group of Jewish soldiers from Ohio's 23rd Regiment, led by J.A. Joel, held an impromptu Seder. One of the unit's Jewish men on leave had shipped matzah and agudas to Fayette, but there were no other supplies. The men went foraging and found 2 kegs of cider, a lamb, several chickens, and eggs. Joel wrote, quote, "Horseradish and parsley we could not obtain, but in lieu we found a weed whose bitterness I apprehend exceeded anything our forefathers enjoyed. The necessaries for charosis we could not obtain, so we got a brick, which rather hard to digest, reminded us by looking at it for what purpose it was intended." End quote. The Seder went perfectly until the men ate the bitter herb. Joel reported, quote, "It was very bitter and fiery like cayenne pepper, and excited our thirst such that we forgot the law authorizing us to drink only 4 cups, and we drank all the cider. Some of the men got roaring drunk," Joel noted, quote, "one thought he was Moses, another Aaron, and one had the audacity to call himself Pharaoh. The consequence was a skirmish with nobody hurt. Only Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh had to be carried back to the camp to sleep it off." It's interesting to see how, despite all this, they still had this connection to Judaism. In 1862, General U.S. Grant issued the infamous General Order Number 11, which expelled Jews from parts of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. This order was promulgated because during the war, there were many people who were black marketeers who would cross the lines between the South and the North, selling supplies, etc. And the population thought that it was the Jews who were doing this. That's what prompted this order. Now, a businessman from Kentucky, Caesar Caskell, went to Washington, D.C., got an audience with Abe Lincoln, and got him to rescind the order. Now, this order did come back to haunt Grant when he later became president. However, he showed no signs of anti-Semitism whatsoever, and in fact, he appointed more Jews to his administration than any president before him. During the Civil War, there were 4 Jews who attained the rank of general in the Union Army. In addition, there were 6 Jewish Union soldiers who received the Medal of Honor, which was our country's highest award, and it was instituted by Congress for Civil War heroes. Incidentally, there was a German immigrant who arrived in 1849, and a very interesting story, and some of you may not realize that you know him. His name was Marcus Spiegel. He married a Quaker, Carolyn, in 1853, and after studying Judaism, she decided to convert. The family was deeply committed to Jewish life. There are numerous preserved letters that were written to his wife explaining his decision to serve in the military and express a strong sense of duty to his adopted country. He and his brother Joseph, who also enlisted, often spoke of opening a store together after the war. Unfortunately, Colonel Marcus Spiegel was killed in battle. However, his brother Joseph went on to open a dry goods store in Chicago and built it into the successful and famous Spiegel Catalog Company. Some of you may remember those big fat catalogs before we had shopping online and Amazon. Now, speaking of little known facts, there are rumors that Abraham Lincoln might have been Jewish. Now, people point to certain hints that lead us to think that. He wore a black hat, he had a beard, his name was Abraham, and he was shot in the temple. Okay, I'll leave the humor to Jackie Mason. By the time the Spanish-American War in 1998, sorry, there were 1 million Jews. There had been waves, as you know, of immigration from Europe. Now, the war itself only lasted 10 weeks, but 5,000 Jews signed up to fight. A large impetus for the US declaring war on Spain was the mysterious blowing up of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. The executive officer of the Maine, was a Jew named Adolf Marix. 15 of the sailors killed in the explosion were Jewish. Marix himself rose to the rank of vice admiral and distinguished himself as commanding officer during the second and third battles of Manzanillo off the Cuban coast. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders gained fame in this war, and the first Rough Rider killed in battle was a 16-year-old Jewish cowboy from Texas, Jacob Wilbuski. Interestingly, in the Spanish-American War, there were 4,000 requests for furlough for the high holidays out of 5,000 total Jewish soldiers. In 1916, right before the US entered World War I, there were 3 million Jews in the US. About 2 million came to the US between 1880 and 1914. Amazingly, 250,000 joined the US Armed Forces. Over 7% of the Jewish population went to fight for their country. By contrast, only 3.5% of the general population went to fight. 100,000 American Jewish soldiers fought under General John J. Pershing. Many of them went on to fight in World War II and the Korean War and other conflicts. There were over 1,100 decorations for bravery that were awarded to Jewish servicemen in World War I. The highest ranking Jewish officer in World War I was Rear Admiral Joseph Strauss, who rose from a lieutenant in the Spanish-American War. He conducted experimental work with torpedoes and received the Distinguished Service Medal for directing mine placement and clearance. Now, a 19-year-old named William Shemin received the Distinguished Service Cross when he took command of his unit and ran across the battlefield 3 times to rescue wounded comrades and then led his unit to safety. There's an interesting footnote to history that I found an article in the newspaper in December of 2011. President Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act, and it contained a provision called the William Shemin World War I Veterans Act. This provided for a review of Jewish soldiers who may have been overlooked for a Medal of Honor due to their faith. Now, at the outbreak of World War II, there were now 5 million Jews out of a total population of 134 million in the US. Over 500,000 Jews entered the military, and more than 10% of them received awards. And by the way, this number included thousands of women. In addition, 40% of American Jewish doctors served in the military during this time. Although he was not as famous as General Patton or General Marshall, Major General Maurice Rose was the highest ranking officer killed in action. He was the son and grandson of rabbis. During the war, he led the 3rd Armored Division and was a career Army officer who also served in World War I. He was known for his aggressive style of leadership and for commanding the division from the front. There's a famous story about a cantor named Max Fuchs. If you look at this picture, which was printed actually in the New York Times in 1944, the gentleman second from the left with the tallis on, with the prayer book, is Max Fuchs. He was a cantor who came from New York, and he was a soldier. He fought in Normandy, fought at D-Day, and was part of the onslaught that took back the first German town. It was called Aachen, Germany. First German town that was retaken in World War II. And at that time, there was a call for a Jewish service. And all these men behind them are Jews who had been there in Aachen and been part of the war, retook the town. And Max Fuchs, they were looking for someone to lead the service. There was a chaplain who was next to him, but Max Fuchs was a cantor, and he volunteered, and he headed the battlefield service. And this service was broadcast in the US live in 1944. By the way, for those of you from the old country, New York, Max Fuchs, was a cantor for many, many years in the Bayside Jewish Center. There is a well-known story about it was a story and a movie actually, about 4 US Jewish chaplains on the USS Dorchester who gave up their life jackets and their lives when the ship was sunk in 1943. One of them was the Jewish chaplain, Alexander Good. It's said that they linked arms and prayed as the ship sank. This was a remarkable display of faith and courage. Admiral Hyman Rickover was known as the father of nuclear navy. Due to his determination and persistence with regard to nuclear power, we now have over 200 nuclear power ships in our Navy. He was the longest serving naval officer in US history, retiring after 63 years of active duty. Sure, he had a nice pension. Now, do I have to say with a name like Hyman, he was Jewish. However, he did convert to Episcopalian and did not follow anything in his Jewish background. There were over a dozen Jews who were supporting the American war efforts in World War II behind the front lines, namely those scientists working on the Manhattan Project, which was, of course, to develop the nuclear bomb. People such as Albert Einstein, Edward Teller, Robert Oppenheimer, Richard Feynman, Leo Szilard, and others. And at the time of the Korean War, there were now 150,000, Jewish men and women who helped protect the country. One of them that I found to have a very interesting story was Tibor Rubin, who was born in Hungary and escaped the Holocaust, survived, came to America and joined the US Army and fought in Korea. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the war as a combatant and a POW. He received his award from President George Bush in 2005, 55 years after the war. The reason being, he was repeatedly nominated, but overlooked because his superior officer in charge of his unit was extremely anti-Semitic and was known for sending him on missions that he did not expect him to return from. There were 30,000 Jewish soldiers who took part in Vietnam conflict. 2 of them won the Medal of Honor. Presently, today, there are over 15,000 men and women on active duty. Now, there are Jews who have served or are serving in Afghanistan and Iraq, and there have been 56 fallen Jewish heroes as of now. One of them includes the first Air Force graduate to be killed, who was a woman. Now, there's a very famous organization you probably know of called the Jewish War Veterans Association. They have branches all over the US. This organization was established in 1896 as originally the Hebrew Union Veterans Association, and it's the oldest veterans group in the US. It was formed in response to the anti-Semitic claims about the lack of patriotism on the part of Jewish Americans. It's estimated to have 30,000 members today. There is a famous building, the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, not to be confused with the Jewish History Museum in Philadelphia. This National Museum of American Jewish Military History was founded in 1958 in Washington, D.C., and it documents and preserves the contribution of Jewish Americans to the peace and freedom of the United States. And it has both permanent and traveling exhibits on a variety of subjects of interest. By the way, there is something that we had seen that was presented in my shul in Young Israel of Hillcrest. Rabbi J.J. Schachter gave an amazing presentation of Kristallnacht and veterans of World War II. He gave this in February. Yeah. I'm sorry. In February, he went to Manila with a group of other people, part of an organization, to change the graves of Jews who were missing in action, who were killed in action, and were not found. And his organization tries to locate, through tremendous research, the Jews who were mistakenly buried under crosses instead of Jewish stars. Because their dog tag either was removed or was not readable, or they didn't have the dog tag, so they didn't know whether they were Jewish or not. In conclusion, we should openly express our pride in the fact that Jewish citizens have contributed to the defense of our society. It's important for fellow Jews as well as non-Jews to know and appreciate this fact. We have served our country proudly and will continue to do so in the future. And we thank all the veterans and anyone out there who is related to a veteran. At this time, I want to thank everyone who joined this presentation. Special thank you again to Judy Steinig for putting this all together, and my wife behind the scenes who handled all my technical work. I couldn't have done it without her. I'd like to wish everyone a happy Hanukkah. Stay safe, be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, so much for that wonderful presentation. Also, thank you, of course, to Wendy and to Joseph for their participation. I just want to say, as somebody whose father, father-in-law, grandfather, and uncles served their country in the military with pride, it was an especially meaningful program for me. And I also want to comment about Max Fuchs. Not only was he the chazan at Bayside Jewish Center, but when he moved over to Young Israel Bayside, where my husband has been the Moed Asra, he was for many, many years a beloved member and also a chazan in our shul. So thank you so much, Jay, for including that. That was wonderful. I think everybody really found this to be a very meaningful program, particularly now with the way things are going in the country. So thank you so much again for participating with this program. I just want to announce that Spirit is going to be taking a break next week for Hanukkah. I'm sure everyone's going to be busy with family, whether it's in person or on Zoom. And we will be returning Be'ezras Hashem on Tuesday, December 22nd. So watch your emails for more details. You'll be hearing about more programs then. And of course, in the meantime, visit the archives and enjoy all the past programs at your convenience. Now, during this month of Kislev in December, as everyone is finalizing the year's charitable contributions, please consider giving to the OU Spirit program so the Orthodox Union can continue this special programming. I just want to wish everyone have a great day. Have a Freilich Hanukkah, have a good Shabbos, and we look forward to seeing you afterwards. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.